All right, well, people can keep joining as we keep building our audience. My name is Bill Walsh, Director of Communications, Center of the American Experiment. Just as a quick overview of the Center of the American Experiment, most of you know who we are by way of signing up for this webinar, I assume, but we are a public policy think tank. And so we do what you'd think a think tank would do. We write and research papers and information and research on a number of topics. Today's topic is the economy and taxes and government. We do a lot of work in the education realm. We do a lot of work in energy, healthcare, crime and crime policy. So those are our broad topics. We do more than write, though. We do more than produce white papers. We like to think we're a think tank that actually does things and acts and participates. And I want to just share my screen and just talk about a couple of things we're doing right now recently. Let's see here, got to hit the share button. So 2 things going on right now at the Center of the American Experiment. If you have not voted on our Golden Turkey contest yet, you need to vote. We have 1 more week of voting. A couple times a year, we focus on the silliest, stupidest spending in the state of Minnesota. It could be the legislature, it could be a city, it could be a county. So we've got 4 nominees, and there's a contest going on right now. You've got this ridiculous empty bus stop in Newport, Minnesota. They built, and that's completely empty now because no one's riding the bus. $6.45 million for that. It sits empty. We are trying to figure out how to prevent bald eagles from flying into windmills. The stupidity of that, but the U of M's got a big contract to try and figure out a sound annoying enough to warn eagles not to fly into windmills. Our point on this is perhaps we shouldn't subsidize and continue to try to get people to build so many windmills. That would be better policy. You've got the land bridge over Highway 94. If you haven't familiar with this project yet, do some reading. The legislature seeded it with $6 million to start an office, hire some staff, start to do the engineering documents. Eventually, this is going to be $1 billion project. They want to cover I-94 for over a half a mile in St. Paul to reconnect the Rondo neighborhood. Whether or not that's a good idea or not, reconnecting the neighborhood, the expenditure of this, the massive engineering is going to be ridiculous. And then our last nominee is the violence interrupters in Minneapolis. The city of Minneapolis is spending $2.5 million a year for violence interrupters. And you don't have to read the paper to see that no violence is getting interrupted. It's a complete waste of money. So Golden Turkey contest is going on. One other thing I want to bring attention to this week, the American Experiment put up a number of billboards around the cities. So if you drive around the Twin Cities, you'll see our new billboard campaign on inflation and the high cost of things going on. So these are some of the billboards. Bacon, obviously up, gasoline, heating. You remember the saying, inflation, the cruelest tax, and we're going to kind of get into taxes and spending today. So apropos that we launched this campaign today, so you can see those billboards as they go up. So I will stop sharing and I will stop talking and introduce John Phelan, our economist at the American Experiment, comes to us via London. We always like bringing people in, from other countries. They seem to know more. If you grew up in Minnesota, you don't know anything, but if you grew up somewhere else and you're here, you're an expert. So John is our expert on the economy and taxes, and he's going to talk about migration and what it's done in our tax situation. I'll hand it over to you, John.
Hello there. Thank you for having me, everybody. I'm just going to set my screen up now to share. There we go. Hopefully that's working. Yeah, my name's John Phelan. I'm an economist at the Centre. I've been here now for 4.5 years since moving here from the United Kingdom, where I worked as a consultant. Did a range of projects, such as the impact of mobile telephony infrastructure on the UK economy, and outlook for mortgage rates, that kind of thing, and also up to macro things such as the impact of Brexit on the British economy. I moved to the US, like I say, 4.5 years ago. My wife is from here, so I kind of got clubbed on over the head and dragged over, which I gather is not uncommon in Minnesota. It's a wonderful place, though. I'm happy to be here. It's an absolutely wonderful part of the world, and there's an awful lot going for it. And what I kind of work on is how we can protect what we have in terms of prosperity here, and how we can actually make things better, for the next generation. We have a thing in this country where every generation lives better than the generation before. And we want to keep that going, because one of the things that you have is this idea that's too common these days, which is that wealth is something that is there. It's just kind of this fixed thing of wealth, and the only real question is how we divide it up. There's far too little thought given, I think, to the question of where this wealth comes from in the first place. And it seems quite obvious to me that if you take this wealth for granted, like manna from heaven, and you don't think about where it comes from, then you run the very real risk of imposing policies that mean you have a lot less wealth to go around than you thought you had. So we have to think about that. We have to think about where it is that the high standard of living that we have in the state has come from. Now, the report I'm going to talk to you about today is this one, Taxes and Migration. It's pretty new. It was a summary of it in the Pioneer Press at the weekend, an op-ed that I wrote. So if you want a short version of it, I've cross-posted that on our website now, so you can go and have a look at that. But download the whole paper. It's all available on our website. Every bit of data that we use is freely available. The IRS, the Census Bureau, Bureau of Economic Analysis, et cetera, et cetera. So anybody who thinks that what I'm saying is twaddle is perfectly free to go and interrogate these data sources themselves. Everything's footnoted. So you can go and have a look at all this for yourself if you think that, if you find what I'm saying kind of challenging, because this is a kind of a sore spot in public policy debate in the state. When you talk about taxes, you know, as we'll see, just a kind of a hint of where we're going to go. Minnesota does have very high taxes compared to other states. We would argue that they're too high and that they need to come down. Other people argue in favor of them for various reasons, which we think are mistaken. Now, one of the reasons that we think our taxes should come down is because of the effect on interstate migration that there is. And so that's really what this report here looks at. We look at migration patterns into and out of Minnesota with other states, and the impact of our taxes on that. So really the kind of jump off point for this, I'm just going to give you a summary of where we're going to go. This is the kind of headline part of the presentation. The first point to note is that Minnesota has below average population growth. And that's really kind of where we jump off from with this report. The second point is that it's persistent losses of residents to other states that contributes towards this. Research does show that taxes influence migration decisions. Minnesota is a high tax state, and Minnesota is losing on net higher earning, more productive workers from the state. I shall talk a little bit about why that's bad news. And a final point, this is to preempt some of probably the most common critique that I receive of this argument, is that Minnesota's high taxes are not buying us a better quality of life. So we're going to kind of work through each of these points in turn. I will talk for maybe half an hour, and that will leave, I think, maybe 20 minutes or so for questions at the end. So we'll go jump in. The first point is that Minnesota's population growth is below average. So you can see here, this is population change as a percent from 2000 to 2020. You will see there the United States rate. The United States population generally grew at 16.8% over that period, whereas Minnesota's population growth rate was 14.7%. We ranked kind of 26 over the period. So kind of in the middle of the states, but below the national rate. That's because there are some states where the population is growing a lot faster than in others, so they kind of skew things a little bit. Those are the states on the right of that chart that you see: Nevada, Utah, Arizona, etc. Of course, the bigger population states up there, Florida and Texas, they had big populations in 2000 that had big increases, so they account for a huge amount of the population growth that there has been this century. Florida and Texas really is where Americans are shifting to. One thing I think is interesting to note about this, often you'll point to Minnesota's population growth and say we're below average, and people will say, well, you know, that's because of the weather. That's a serious point. People do say that. I've got this footnoted in the report. Paul Krugman, who was once a very fine economist and is now just kind of ranting in the New York Times, he actually makes an argument in there that I refer to and I footnote, that this migration away from states like Minnesota and to other states is driven by air conditioning, and the fact that the invention of air conditioning makes hotter climates more habitable. Now, in actual fact, the evidence doesn't really support that argument. And just if you want to eyeball this, I've highlighted Minnesota's neighbors in yellow. You'll see that Iowa has much lower population growth even than Minnesota. So does Wisconsin. But what's interesting is that our neighbors to the west, North and South Dakota, both have rates of population growth this century, which are not only higher than ours, but are higher than the national average. Perhaps not by very much, you might say. But it does give the lie to the idea that, your geography is destiny in terms of population growth. Those two state people aren't, they aren't doing better in terms of their population growth because their weather's better than here. So there is something else at play. There is some other factor that influences this. Now we move on to our second point, which is that it's persistent losses of residents to other states contribute to this. This is a fact. Population growth or population change. It comes from the difference between births over deaths, which is a kind of organic portion of it. And then there's also kind of movements in and out, kind of net migration. Now, Minnesota gets residents, in terms of migration from two different sources. One is other countries and one is other states. Now, I talk a lot more in this report, almost solely, in fact, about immigration from an immigration to other states in America. This is the reason for this is that Minnesota, we have a kind of net inflow most years, not every year, but most years of residents from other countries, which often is greater than the outflow of residents that we have to other states. So we have actually, if you add the two sources of migration together, we often have positive net migration to Minnesota, but that's basically because we have more people coming in from other countries than we have going out to other states on net. But the thing with that is once these people arrive in Minnesota from other places, they then count in the data just like anybody else. So when you start to see people on net leaving the state, some are in there or some of those people who moved here from other countries. So those immigrants, once they're here, I mean, they behave like anybody else. There was, they respond to taxes and spending and incentives like that, just like anybody else. So when you'll start to see these net migration rates into and out of Minnesota, you have to think that once people have arrived in this country, they then feed into those numbers there. Now, what this shows you here, this is the annual net domestic migration into and out of Minnesota. There's basically three data sources here. One of the interesting things when you start to look at the data is how many different numbers you can get for the same thing. So what I think is useful to do is to take a number of them and kind of put them all together and then, see what the pattern is rather than say, this is the number. So what we have here is internal. So the yellow line is the Census Bureau's annual population estimates. The purple line is the Internal Revenue Service. They track people moving around the country, finding their tax returns. And you see that they both basically tell you the same story. Now, it's not a huge surprise because they do collaborate on the data. So you would expect to see the kind of patterns the same there, and they are. And you see there that this is an interesting one, actually. You see that Minnesota's net migration turned negative in 2002, and it kind of remained negative for a good number of years after that. Then there was a couple of years where it became positive again. So in 2017, 2018, this was very widely reported in Minnesota's media. People were very, very excited about this. It showed that people love high taxes and big government spending. But then the numbers crashed. And so in 2019 and 2019, we had a net flow of residents out of the state again. And in 2020, actually, we lost about 10,000 residents, according to the Census Bureau, net domestic migrants. So if we subtract the number of people moving into Minnesota from other states from the number of people moving out, the difference is a net. And we actually see that we lost about 10,000 people on net to other states in 2020. That's, as you see, that's like the third biggest over the period that we have, which is like 30 years. So that's pretty hefty. And that was not reported so much in Minnesota's media. Minnesota's media, and this is, a personal gripe, is that they do like good news stories about the state. They are not the most inquisitive, perhaps. The third source that we have here is the Census Bureau. They do a thing called the American Community Survey. You can get into kind of a methodological question about which of these is best. As I say, just whack them all on the chart and see what they tell you. And this doesn't really, I don't think, tell you a hugely different story, except the American Community Survey records a net loss of residents, domestic migrants, out migrants, from Minnesota in every year from 2005 up to 2019. Which is the most recent year for which that data is available. So this does tell you, I think a very clear story, which is that for the last, nearly 20 years now, Minnesota has persistently lost residents, domestic residents to and from other states. Where are they coming from and where are they going to? This chart here shows you the domestic migrants into and out of Minnesota for between 2 years. So this is kind of almost a decade's worth of numbers. The ones in green show on towards the right. They show you where people came from into Minnesota, and the ones on red show you on net where we lost them to. You can see that the biggest source of domestic migrants into Minnesota was Illinois. We gained 11,674 residents over this decade from Illinois on net. And our biggest loss was to Florida. We lost about 22,000 residents over this decade to Florida. So you can see there Arizona, Texas as the next one. But also, again, another argument for the it's all the weather people. I can understand you might move to Florida, Arizona, or Texas for better weather, but I don't know, would you move to Colorado or Washington for better weather? I suspect not. If I'm wrong, please do tell me. And again, Illinois, I mean, if you're moving out of Illinois, why would you move to Minnesota? If weather's, the big factor, you'd move somewhere else, wouldn't you? Now, the thing about this is if you compare Illinois and Iowa, which are the two furthest on the right here, you would expect Illinois has got a much bigger population than Iowa. So Illinois could afford to lose 12,000 people and it wouldn't necessarily affect the population that much. Iowa's population loss, which is less than half of Illinois' net loss to us, that might be a situation that proportionally is greater because of its much smaller population. Well, so that we can look at that more closely and investigate and start to compare some of these rates, what I've done is calculated the ratio of net migrants of net in-migrants to out-migrants. And that's what this chart shows you here. So where you see a number over 1, that means that there are more people moving into the state than moving out. So those are the people we gain from. And where you've got a number less than 1, so that's that black line across the middle there, that's where we're losing states too. So we've got more people moving out than moving in. Again, the story is not hugely different, although it's slightly different. Again, Illinois is still way up on the right there, but you bump Rhode Island and Maine up there. So this is an interesting one because, you start to see Vermont's up there. That's kind of a high tax state. And then down the other end, this is an interesting one. Florida's still there. Arizona and Texas are still there. Washington's still there, with its crummy weather. And so, you start to see that this gives you some idea, I think, of where we're gaining residents from and where we're losing them to. What's interesting, if you look back at this, is that the bars on the red, in the red, add up to a lot more than the bars on the green. So that's where our net loss of residents over this period comes from. Now, research does show that taxes influence migration decisions. There is a recent paper that came out from a number of economists. It was in the Journal of the American Economic Association. And I'm going to give you a quote here, so I'm going to read from this. This paper reviewed what we know about mobility responses to personal taxation and found that, quote, there is growing evidence that taxes can affect the geographic location of people both within and across countries. This migration channel creates another efficiency cost of taxation with which policymakers need to contend when setting tax policy. Now, I want to say that because that's a summary of the research. These are independent academic economists looking at all the research on the impact of taxes on migration and saying that, yeah, it does have an impact. Now, I stress that because I tell people this, I make this argument, and I get told that it's just not true. I testified at the state capitol last year, but also earlier this year in the legislature. And I was told flatly in the tax committee that there's no evidence of this. There's no evidence that taxes drive migration. And when I actually held a copy of that paper up, and I was just basically told it didn't exist. So, so much for evidence-based and policy and following the science. What I would say, if you look at this chart that's on here, it's perhaps slightly opaque, so I will give you a bit of a talk through it. This is shows you the tax burden in other states. So Minnesota's not on the horizontal axis here. It's a tax rate in other states, the tax burden. And on the vertical axis, you've got the ratio of in-migrants to out-migrants. Now, what you see, so the black line that is vertical, that's Minnesota, and that's our tax burden. And the black line that's vertical above it is where we gain residents from, and below it is where we lose residents to. And what this shows you quite clearly, actually, in I write in the report about the statistical significance of this, the p-values and all the rest of it. This does find actually a significant relationship between the tax burden in other states and whether Minnesota gains residents from them or loses residents to them. And so what you see, if you start on the right-hand side of this chart, that's the high tax burden in other states. And because we're up in the top right corner generally, we're gaining residents from these high tax states. But as we start to look at lower tax states, moving left on this chart, we actually start to see that we're losing residents. So you do see, again, this relationship that has been found in the academic literature, that tax rates are one of the factors anyway that drive migration. Of course, there's all sorts of things that go into this, but you don't know what you're talking about, or you're lying if you say that taxes aren't part of that picture. Minnesota's numbers are just part of a bigger picture. I did some more number crunching for this. It shows you the same thing. So this is that ratio of in-migrants to out-migrants, so that we can compare these things. This is for every state. So that's why the line slopes the other way, because you're kind of switching the position that you're looking at it from. And this shows you again a statistically significant relationship between the average tax burden of a state and whether it gains residents or loses residents. So again, if you look at the horizontal axis there, if you look at the left-hand side, that's low tax states, and they're above that black line. They're in the top left-hand corner, which means that they have a high ratio of in-migrants to out-migrants. So they're gaining residents. And as you look across the other way, they're losing them. So again, there you see research does show that taxes influence migration decisions. Now, if you put those two things together, the fact that Minnesota is losing residents, and the fact that Minnesota has high taxes, and then the fact that research shows that the two things are related, we should not be surprised to see the tax losses, the population losses that we see, the domestic outmigration, because Minnesota is a high tax state. There's a number of ways you can look at this. This chart here shows you the burden of states' sales, property, and individual income taxes. Take all that as a share of personal income in 2019. That's the most recent year for which we've got data. And Minnesota ranks 6th there, as you can see, with a tax burden of 10.2%. So we are a high tax state. Sometimes, believe it or not, there are people who say that we're not. Unfortunately, one of them was our Commissioner for Employment and Economic Development recently. I'm not sure how he arrived at that calculation, but there we are. It's out there on Twitter. But this shows you Minnesota is a high tax state. This is a tax burden. In very large part, this is driven by high tax rates. And so you can see here, this shows you the top rate of state personal income tax and Minnesota's lowest rate. There are the two blue bars there. And this is an interesting thing to note, I think, because our lowest rate of state income tax in Minnesota, everyone knows that we have a high top rate of income tax. What most people don't know is that we have a high starting rate of income tax as well. So much so that our lowest rate of state personal income tax is higher than the tax rate, the top tax rate in about 25, 26 other states. That includes places like Alaska, Florida, Nevada, etc., the ones down there that don't charge any state income tax at all. Not coincidentally, perhaps, Texas and Florida, two states that don't charge any state income tax, are the ones, if you remember from our charts earlier, that have seen big domestic migratory inflows. And so, yeah, the point I would make with this, though, is, yeah, we tax the rich heavily. I don't think too many people would deny that. But we also tax everybody heavily. If you look at that rate there, that lowest rate, that 5.35%, that's still quite of a heavy tax rate to impose as the starting rate. We're also a state that imposes quite a high estate tax as well. And this shows you here we're one of the few states to have one, and our rate is quite high, our exemptions are quite low. And so, this is one of the things the research also, not only does the research find that income taxes influence migration patterns, but it finds that wealth taxes do so as well. So if you put all this together, I think you get a very clear argument. What you see is that we have below average population growth. Part of that is driven by our domestic outmigration. We know that from the research that taxes drive some of those migratory patterns, and we know that Minnesota has high taxes. So we see all this. So we shouldn't really be surprised by anything that we see here. The outflow of domestic residents to other states. One thing I would say, and this is to kind of preempt something that I'm sure is going to come up, and I want to put this in because this is the most common response that I have when I make this argument is, well, yeah, okay, we have high tax rates and we have a high tax burden, but that's the price we pay for making Minnesota a really kind of cool place to live. Well, it's just not true. I'm jumping ahead there. One thing I want to say about the losses of population that we have is that if you look at this, and this kind of spins off the previous chart, is that we actually lose residents. So, like I say, everyone knows that we lose people or that we tax high earners heavily. As I say, we also tax not very high earners quite heavily. And I think that you see that in this chart here. What this chart shows you using IRS data is the net changes or net inflows and outflows of residents by the income of the primary taxpayer. This is over a period of years from 2000 to 2019. And what you see is that we actually gain residents, that's the green bars there on the left-hand side, we gain residents in every income category up to $50,000 a year. We lose residents in every income category above $50,000 a year on net. Now, this is, bad news because if you look at the data, I mean, this makes 2 points, I think. Firstly, when you talk about the net outflow of population from Minnesota, we're not just talking about rich people. We're talking about people on incomes of $50,000 a year, so solid middle class people. We're losing those on net. But one of the things is, it's kind of fashionable to bash the rich now. But if you look at Minnesota, there's 2 points I would make about that. If you make an assumption that salaries are kind of a reflection of productivity, and that is a standard economic assumption, that you can always find an exception, but we're talking about, the kind of general tendency here. This shows really that Minnesota is kind of losing productive workers. Now, you might not like rich people. You might want to, ship them all out of the state, send them somewhere else. But you are going to suffer if you lose them in terms of per capita GDP, because if you're losing people who are more productive, then that does lower your per capita incomes. A second point to make is that rich people do pay an awful lot of tax. I've written about this, I write about it in a report, but the Minnesota Department of Revenue puts out a tax incidence study, and that shows you very clearly that Minnesotans of higher incomes, particularly the top 10% of earners and the top 1% of earners, they pay an amount of state income tax that's vastly disproportionate, not only to their numbers, but to their incomes as well. So if you start to lose these people, that is going to have a detrimental effect on state revenues. Now, just to go back to the point I was making earlier about, the common response to this is that this is, great news. This is the price we pay for a great place to live. I actually looked at the numbers on this. This shows you the same old thing, scatter plot, and it looks at the relationship. This is not in the report, by the way. This shows you the relationship between the ranking of state tax burdens and the ranking of best to worst states that's put out by US News, which is it's kind of the common one that people tend to point to when they're saying, oh, we've got a high quality of life here. And we do. You can actually see Minnesota highlighted there down at the bottom left of that chart. And you see that Minnesota does have a high tax burden, and we do have a pretty good ranking on the Better States Index. And so generally when I, say that our taxes are too high and people respond and say, well, that's the price we pay for a great state. And then sometimes in a kind of less charitable response, they will say, well, if you don't like it, move to Mississippi. Well, no one ever says if you don't like it, move to New Hampshire. And yet, if you look at this chart, you can see New Hampshire over there in the bottom right. They actually have a higher quality of life than we do, as judged by US News, and a much lower tax burden. And so it goes to show what this shows you that there is two things. Firstly, there is absolutely no relationship. And if you look at the p-values, the statistical significance, they tell you the same thing. There is no relationship between a state's tax burden and its quality of life, or its goodness, however judged. It just isn't there. So the argument that Minnesota's high taxes are the price we pay for it being a great place to live is just not true. The data do not support that argument. And a second point to make, and this is perhaps a kind of more broader point, is it's the triumph, I think, of data over anecdote. I can always point to one particular thing and say, this shows such and such. My great aunt, for example, smoked 20 cigarettes a day at least and died when she was in her 90s. Now, does that prove to you that smoking does not negatively impact your life expectancy? Of course it doesn't, because there's a much broader data set than just my great aunt. And it's the same story with this. People who point to Minnesota with its high quality of life and high taxes and say that the one causes the other are not really thinking sensibly through the subject. And like I say, you can point to New Hampshire and that tells you the other story. Which tells you the true story? The answer is that neither of them do on their own, and they both don't together. What you have to do is stand back, as we do here, and look at a much broader data set. And again, that shows you, just to repeat, there is absolutely no relationship in the data between a state's tax burden and its quality of life. That brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure. And we've got some time now to take questions, so I shall go over to Bill.
Okay. I forgot to plug in the beginning too that we would have time for questions, so I'm a bad host. But you can use the Q&A box to do questions, and while people are thinking of questions, I can do some of my own. I don't know. Maybe we'll keep the screen up, John, or maybe you want to stop sharing. But I don't know what's more distracting. But maybe we might need those slides anyway.
Yeah.
Let me ask my on behalf of I won't say he's my friend, but on behalf of former Governor Mark Dayton, let me ask Mark Dayton's question. If he was watching this panel, if he was watching this discussion, he would say, I got full control of the legislature in 2013. I ran on taxing the rich. And in 2013, I was able to do that. I created a new fourth tier. You saw that on the charts, the 10% or more top tax rate. And everybody said the sky was going to fall, and the Republican legislators said we're gonna not have the income we're gonna have anymore. And I'm here to tell you, in 2021, my tax increases worked. We've had more revenue into the state almost every year. Certainly at the moment, we're looking at a huge budget surplus, and that tax increase that I didn't hurt the state. What say you, John, to Mark Dayton?
What I would say is that its tax increase completely failed on its own terms. You have to remember that when the tax increase was passed, it was explicitly said that rich people would pay more, a greater share of taxes in Minnesota as a result of this tax being passed. That has not happened. I mentioned the Department of Revenue's incidence reports in the talk. Now, the incidence reports, what they do is they break down. So you've got, every household in Minnesota ranked the highest to the lowest by income. You divide these into groups of 10, these deciles. And what they do is they look at those and they say that the top 10% of households by income earned X percent of the income and paid Y percent of the taxes. And so what you would expect to see if the Dayton tax hike had worked on its own terms is a greater share of state income tax paid by the top earners, by the top 10% of households or the top 1% of households. We do not see that. The incidence reports show very, very clearly, and the Department of Revenue puts these out, not some, we don't do it, the Department of Revenue does it. They show very, very clearly that the share of total state income tax paid by the top 10% of households or the top 1% of households in Minnesota has not changed at all since well before the passage of the Dayton tax hike, sorry. So what that shows you is that they haven't worked on their own terms. What they were sold as doing, they weren't sold, this isn't, I'm going to pass this income tax and things aren't going to fall apart. We were told when the income tax was passed that it would lead to the rich paying a greater share of state income tax. That hasn't happened. Now, if the rich have paid more in tax as a result of these tax hikes, then the only way that that can be reconciled with what we see in the incidence report is if everybody else has started to pay more in tax as well. Because don't forget that the shares of income tax paid by household income decile have not changed. So the only way that one can be paying more in tax to leave those deciles in change is if everyone has started paying more. Now the rates for at the lower end of the scale, the 5.35%, for example, they haven't changed. In fact, they've gone down slightly. So what you see is that the Dayton tax hike didn't work on its own terms. Now, the question of, where this mass exodus of people, they say, well, it hasn't happened. I mean, look at the IRS numbers. Let's go back to this, for example. So this is, this doesn't start immediately. This starts just before the Dayton tax hike. But you do see the numbers. I can show you, numbers broken down by income group for net migration rates. And you do actually see a spike in domestic out-migration around the passage of the Dayton tax cut. But this does show you, this is IRS records. This is people where they're finding their taxes, moving from, and this does show you a loss of residents. And it's not the kind of super rich who are the biggest. Biggest loss is actually in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. Maybe that's because there's more people earning that category that are above $200,000. But this does show you a net loss of people at that income level. There's your answer. There's your answer in the data. If you want to say to me, why is it that the income tax take hasn't collapsed? One thing I would say is that rich people have many more ways of altering and responding to a tax hike than most people do. So, for example, what percentage of my income comes from labor in terms of wages? It's basically all of it, I think. If you put an income tax up, I can't really avoid it. If you start tinkering about with taxes on investments and all things like that, well, then I do have the capacity to avoid that. That's easier to do, but that's not people like me, and it's not people, the average Minnesotan. It's people further up the income scale. Those are the people who, when they're faced with a tax hike, have the ability to decide whether they will pay it or not.
Yeah, I think this gets at one of the main points, and we saw somebody in the chat say they work at 3M, and a lot of the 3M vice presidents, even directors and people, when they retire, are moving to Naples, Florida. It really gets at who is leaving and who is staying. And the broader point is, yes, the statistics and the tax revenue and all the numbers and everything, but when you start taking community leaders, people who give to their church, to nonprofits, to hospitals, to museums, to the Center of the American Experiment, our donors, for instance, when those people who are entrepreneurs, people who create businesses and create jobs, who start the next business, they're all leaving at a time when we need them to stay. So it kind of gets to that point. All right, we've got a ton of questions, John. Let's see if we can whip through a bunch and do quantity for a while and not quantity. Some simple things. IRS income numbers you're using, are those earned income or AGI or taxable? What on the IRS?
Adjusted gross income.
Okay.
So it's the AGI.
Great. We thought this might come up. The Star Tribune yesterday had an article about people moving in Minneapolis, buying houses in Minneapolis and St. Paul, actually. More of a real estate discussion, but people are clearly not leaving Minneapolis, or they are. Other people are buying their houses. How do you respond to that article? We talked about that a little bit yesterday.
Yeah, to some extent, it kind of goes back to the point I made about anecdote versus data. Okay, we've got people moving into Minneapolis, but the data show that there's people moving out of the state from other places. Some from Minneapolis, some from, Bloomington or wherever. And so the idea that, we still got this constant churn in Minneapolis, I'm not entirely surprised by that. We have seen, and it's a huge century plus long trend in America, a movement of people moving to live in cities. Now that includes suburbs, and so we had this kind of, initially people moved into urban cores, then they kind of moved out after World War II into suburbs, and there is now some movement into urban cores again. We see that across the country. But again, what I would say is, I mean, it's a different report. It's our economy report. But if you look at Minneapolis, St. Paul MSA, and compare us to our kind of peer group this century. So what I did, I looked at MSAs in 2000, and I picked, I think, the 7 that were higher than us in terms of GDP and the 7 that were lower than us to create a peer group, and then look at how they have fared over the subsequent 20 years now. You do actually see that about the only one that we've actually done worse than Baltimore. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think we've only done better out of this whole kind of 14 peers than one in terms of GDP growth. So, you know, the Twin Cities, if you only look at the Twin Cities, you might get the idea that things are great. You might not. But like I say, you've got to step back and look at the whole picture to see what's really going on.
Yeah. Quick one. We had a chart up, I think it was US News and World Report, quality of life. Do you remember what went into that quality of life index?
Well, it's a whole bunch of things. So one of the things, this is an interesting thing I've written about on the website before. If you look at one of the ways they put this index together, they look at things like state fiscal policy. And we actually always score really bad ratings in that. You know, that's one thing that's dragging us down. Where we have kind of higher scores and the things that push us up, is very often kind of health things, you know, quality of, you know, life. So, you know, how many parks you've got and things like that, which are not necessarily government policy that drives those things. One thing I think is interesting is very often these kind of quality of life states. You see it slightly less with these than with some others, but you see that there is a clustering, and so that the higher quality of life is kind of an upper Midwest thing. So you're not necessarily, are you measuring the quality of life, or are you measuring certain Midwestern traits and characteristics? You know, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's perhaps worthy of further study.
Here's a really good, they're all really good questions, but I don't want, this one's particularly good. Any thoughts on which is a bigger driver in terms of people making the decision to leave? Higher income tax rates or estate taxes? And you've talked about, I think you wrote it in the report, you kind of can't have both. You either get revenue from an estate tax or you get revenue from high income tax rates. We have both and it doesn't work, right? One of them is going to suffer. So which one do you think is a bigger factor?
Well, it's hard to say one or the other, but I think if you take them together is an interesting point. So the study that you refer to, I did one in 2018 on Minnesota's estate tax. We looked at various data sources, you know, because you're having to kind of construct your own here. So we looked at various sources and found that there was evidence that people were leaving as a result of the estate tax. And then we estimated, because when people move, so there's an amount that the revenue that the estate tax brings in terms of revenue, an actual revenue effect. But then there's the incentive effect, I called it, which is the revenue that you lose when people move to avoid paying it. And they move out of the state and they take with them future income tax payments, sales tax payments, et cetera, et cetera. And so I put a few assumptions, you know, how old they were, how much they paid. And so I was able to figure out and how many left each year and calculate an estimate of, you know, so this is how much revenue comes in, this is how much revenue we lose, and which is greater. And they found that generally we're losing money, or the state government is losing money because of the estate tax. Now, you know, you may think that that's pie in the sky, but there was a paper by two academic economists who used a completely different method. And they looked at, I think it was tax returns of millionaires. And they found, their findings are very interesting. They tried to calculate the same thing, actually, which was the amount of revenue brought in versus the amount of revenue pushed out by estate taxes. And they found that for most states, actually, the amount of revenue that it brings in is greater than the amount that's pushed out. But one of the states that they found where the story was different was Minnesota. They found that, as our report had found, the amount of revenue pushed out of the state was greater than the amount of revenue that the estate tax brought in. And they found actually that when you looked at all the other states where that was the case, it was all states with a high income tax rate, a high top rate of income tax. So the finding was crystal clear, which is that you can have either a high rate of estate tax or a high rate of income tax, but you can't have both. And, you know, it's really concerning that in the last session, there were serious proposals to raise both the top rate of income tax and the estate tax. And this is seriously considered.
Mm-hmm. Another great question. Trends in working from home specifically with the reaction to the pandemic and what we've learned about that. I mean, what do you think that's going to have to do with migration?
Well, it will have some effect. So it will be a situation where, I mean, people have kind of worked from home for the best part of a year, I suppose, and it shows that you can do it. The question is whether it's, you know, as good as working in the office. I mean, that varies from place to place. I do think that you will see most of it. The change happens at the margin. So what you will start to see is there will be some people who will people who, you know, who would look at their high tax burden now in Minnesota and so I'd love to move somewhere else, but then there's a cost of getting another job and that's just not really worth it. If the cost of getting another job vanishes and you can just work from your office, well, then that calculation changes for people at the margin. So there will be some effect of this, I'm quite sure. And across America, actually, it's going to make, I think, workers more responsive to tax rates in terms of their migration patterns. It's interesting, I think, so obviously if you're working at Walmart, you'll still have to live near the Walmart. So if you're kind of a service worker and you generally earn kind of a lower wage, you know, you can't move. This will be people in kind of higher tech things who are kind of rich. And the evidence shows that they generally are more responsive to tax rates anyway. So this is just kind of one more thing that kind of helps rich people,
Not
really. If you look at what New York State is an interesting one to keep an eye on. They're really concerned about tax migration in New York State, and they're trying to make it a lot. They're basically trying to tax anybody who spends any time in New York. So if you went and gave a seminar in New York for one day, they want to make it so that they can charge you income tax on your whole income. And so, I mean, that's because they're deeply worried about people just shifting out of the state and taking all their tax base with them.
Mm-hmm. Bring the chart up again with people moving in and people moving out by income. The question is, why are people moving here? So the chart shows people in the lower income stratus, like 25 to 50 and under 50,000 are moving here. Why? What's bringing those people to Minnesota?
That's kind of an open question. I mean, you can speculate on all sorts of things. I mean, this is kind of I moved 4,000 miles to live here. It's kind of a nice place, you know. It does have a lot going for it. Maybe these people are gluttons for bad sport. I don't know. But there's all kinds of like I say, I wouldn't want to say that tax is the only reason that people move into or out of a state, and so whatever reason you give is not going to be the only thing. As for this, you know, I would say I would not like to speculate on it, but I would invite any suggestions that people have for what this might be.
Great. Time for a couple more. Shoot, where did the one go I wanted to ask? Well, let me ask this one. Somebody brings up Social Security. I mean, you haven't mentioned that in your report, but Minnesota still taxes part of Social Security income. We've whittled it down over the past few sessions, but how is that going to impact our comparisons to other states and migration?
Well, it will have an effect. Again, at the margin, if you're looking, you know, what's my income going to be, there will be people for whom that is a deciding factor. So it will have some effect. You know, I mean, how long will this continue indefinitely? As I say, you know, we have politicians here who wanted to raise one of the highest income tax rates and one of the highest estate tax rates even further in the last session. So I'm not hugely optimistic in the short term that the same politicians would change that in terms of the taxation of Social Security. I'm one of those people who thinks it's kind of wacky to tax Social Security because, you know, you were taxed once and tax you when you give it back to you. It seems kind of stupid. So yeah, I mean, that will have some effect again at the margin.
Somebody asked if we are sharing this information with legislators, you know, like the report, and just talk about our advocacy, because you mentioned a little bit that you've been over to testify, but we are trying, right?
Yeah, we actually, so when the estate tax report came out, we actually put billboards up about the estate tax. I mean, I don't know too many other people would do that. And, so we do things like that. We write op-eds. So I had an op-ed about this, summarizing this report in the Pioneer Press at the weekend. There will be others in other places to come. In terms of the report, we do kind of send it over to legislators, copies, so that they can read it. So we do want to kind of change legislators' minds, but we also want to change, the kind of the public's mind on these things. A lot of legislators will kind of talk to us and say, oh, we know you're right and we would like to do it, but it's politically difficult. And I think a lot of what we are about is creating a safe space for legislators to do what they know is the right thing to do. They do need it. Like we talked about me testifying up at the Capitol, something that a lot of us here do fairly regularly. And the nonsense that you hear in these committee meetings, it would turn your hair grey. Like I say, you can hold up a review of research that says one thing and you get told basically it doesn't exist. So crazy stuff.
Yeah, and we are up in our game there. We are up in our advocacy game in terms of messages into the legislature and other people that make decisions. We'll be at the legislature again. We have a legislative agenda we're working on that you'll see in the next issue of Thinking Minnesota that comes out in January. So a lot of information will be in there, and we'll certainly bring that to the legislature. It's very difficult to go there right now because of the pandemic. The buildings are locked. I think it's outrageous. Capitol's basically locked. Well, the Capitol's actually open, but the Senate office building and the House office building are locked down. You can't walk in and find a legislator. There's nobody there, so that's a little bit of a problem. Final question. We have just a few minutes left. Solutions. I mean, is it as simple as cut taxes? I mean, what are the solutions? Okay, you've defined the problem. We are losing people on a net basis to other states. Largely, a big factor, our tax burden. Is that the simple solution?
Well, it would help. I'm not going to say that if we cut taxes, all this would stop, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. The idea that, I mean, one of the crazy things that you hear is that if we cut taxes, everyone would be out orphans starving in the streets and all the rest of it, that we'd be returning to the horse and buggy days or something like a Dickens novel. That's just not true. We spend so much money in this state in real inflation adjusted terms per capita. We're spending more money now and we were before the pandemic. I mean, with various kind of federal handouts, government money's gone through the roof. But even before the pandemic in 2019, we were spending more money in real inflation adjusted terms per capita, the state government was, than at any time in Minnesota history. So the idea that the state government would fall apart if its revenue was trimmed by 5% or something. You show me a business that couldn't cut cost by 5%, switching to cheaper copier paper, using one ply in the bathroom or something. It can be done. And the idea, I mean, I would ask anybody, do you really believe that the state government is such a leanly efficient beast that there isn't, say, 5% wastage that can be cut somewhere? I would think that is an incredibly optimistic view of the state government.
Yep. And we will be at the Capitol at the end of January advocating for this and other things. Just some final notes. Thanks for everybody for joining. It was a great discussion. Thanks, John, for the report. We will have the reports online already. Lots of posts that John has done about parts of the report. He'll continue to do that. The presentation you have today will be emailed out, including we recorded this thing. So if you want to watch it again or share it with people, that will be available too. So all of the material we will get out to people as soon as we can. Again, thanks for everybody for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.